When an avoidant loses you, they rarely ask themselves, what was my role in this? Instead, a quiet and far more dangerous process begins. They rewrite the story, and in this new version, you are no longer the person who gave, endured, and stayed far longer than you should have. You become the one who ended the relationship. This isn't because they lack the ability to see the truth, but because acknowledging it would shatter the fragile shell they've built around themselves. Owning their mistakes means facing the mirror. And the mirror is the one place they've always run from. Psychologist Karen Horney called this protective blame displacement, the act of shifting responsibility away from oneself, not to avoid justice, but to avoid shame. For an avoidant, shame is not just unpleasant, it's unbearable. So they place it on someone else, and that someone is often you. Suddenly, your boundaries become coldness. Your absence becomes abandonment, and your leaving becomes proof of every fear they've ever held about you. This isn't just a defensive move, it's a way of keeping control over the narrative. Because in their mind, the one who's wrong has no power, and the one who's right stays safe. But the truth is, the more they try to put their mistakes on you, the more those mistakes begin to quietly consume them from the inside. And that's why they fall into a specific pattern, 5 psychological tactics they use to shift the blame onto you and prove themselves right every single time. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. Make sure to watch the full video because the tactics shared at the end are the most important. The silence weapon. When after you leave, they use it to make you doubt yourself. When you walk away from an avoidant person, they rarely, if ever, admit their mistake right away. Instead, they pull out a psychological weapon that appears non-aggressive on the surface, but is deeply destructive underneath: silence. This silence is not just the absence of words. It is a calculated move designed to create unease and self-doubt in your mind. When you end the relationship, you might expect them to talk, explain, or at least clarify their position, but instead they retreat into a deep stillness. They know that you will begin to fill that void yourself, thinking and overthinking, wondering if you reacted too strongly or if perhaps you were actually the one in the wrong. This is the exact moment their strategy begins to work. After you leave, their silence becomes a kind of psychological smoke that hides the real issue. What was originally about their behavior, neglect, or lack of commitment gradually shifts toward being about you, your overreactions, or your irrational behavior. They deliberately avoid giving any explanation because explaining could expose the truth. Instead, they use silence in such a way that you begin to fit yourself into their narrative. Philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau once said, "Silence is the most dangerous reply." For the avoidant, this danger is aimed at you so that under emotional pressure, you return, apologize for your words, or forget the real issue and try to restore the relationship. You must recognize why this tactic often appears right after you leave. It's because at that moment, they have lost the most control, and silence is the last weapon they have to try and flip the situation. They know that if they attack you directly, you will defend yourself. But if they say nothing, you will begin making the case against yourself. The first step in breaking this cycle is learning to sit with their silence without feeling compelled to end it by reaching out. Keep the original incident fresh in your mind. Did you truly cross a line, or is this just their psychological game? Write down what happened so they can't make you doubt your own memory. Psychologist Harriet Lerner once said, "Our job is not to answer the silence, but to answer what the silence erases." That means you must stand firm in your boundaries, no matter how long they choose to remain silent. When you refuse to let their silence turn into a weapon against your conscience, they lose its greatest advantage. And then, whether they admit it or not, the truth remains in front of them. You're gone. And even their silence can't bring you back. The history rewrite. For an avoidant, the past is not a fixed reality, but a soft clay. They reshape to fit their narrative. When you leave their life, they quietly craft a new story, a version where you are at fault and they remain safe. Moments where you step back for your own protection or peace of mind become, in their telling, proof that you were disloyal. Your boundaries are reframed as coldness, and your silence is painted as indifference. Nietzsche once said that memory does not simply preserve the past, it shapes it. This is the principle they operate on. The facts remain, but the order and meaning are altered. They take specific events out of context, present your reaction as the core problem, and push their own reasons into the background. They repeat exaggerated phrases like "you always" or "you never," until slowly you start doubting your own memory. This is when gaslighting begins to take hold. You feel as if your recollections are breaking apart, as though your story has been taken from you. The first way to recognize this is simple. If every memory, every conversation in their version somehow makes you always wrong and them always innocent, understand that the past is being rewritten. To protect yourself from this trap, safeguard your memories, write down the important details so no one can make you question them. Don't argue every point they make because each rebuttal only fuels their narrative. Keep the full context alive in your own mind. Remember that events have an entire background, not just the fragment they choose to tell. Above all, maintain your boundaries, even if it means disengaging entirely from these debates. Psychologist Leopold Sandy once said that we rarely remember reality itself. We remember what is bearable for us, for the avoidant. What is unbearable is acknowledging their own role in failure. That is why they twist the past. But when you recognize this process and refuse to play the role they've assigned in their rewritten script, you remain the owner of your truth, no matter what name they give you in their version, and that is the moment their narrative begins to crack. Because no matter how long a lie is maintained, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. The projection reflex for an avoidant. One of the most effective ways to protect themselves from accountability is to turn the spotlight away from their actions and place it squarely on you. This isn't just lying, it's projection, a psychological defense mechanism that allows them to unload their own guilt, shame, and fear onto someone else in their world. The easiest way to avoid being the villain is to cast you in the role first. If they were distant, they'll call you detached. If they were dishonest, they'll insist you weren't transparent. If they flirted with others, they'll accuse you of betrayal. Philosopher Friedrich Hebel once said, "Every guilty person is his own hangman, but the avoidant is unwilling to live with that sentence. Instead, they hand you the rope." At first, you might find yourself defending every word, every action, trying to prove your innocence. But this is exactly how the trap works. The more you defend, the guiltier you appear in their narrative. Over time, you may start to question yourself. Did I really say something wrong? Did I miss a sign? That's the poison of projection. It plants doubt where certainty once lived. The signs are subtle at first. They'll twist small events into proof of your wrongdoing, often using selective memory to omit their own behavior. They might say, "You've been pulling away for weeks," when in truth, they were the ones creating the distance. Or they'll claim, "You made me act this way," shifting the cause of their choices onto your shoulders. Psychologist Carl Jung described projection as the unconscious transfer of our own traits onto others. But in the avoidant's hands, it's not just unconscious, it becomes a deliberate way to rewrite the emotional balance of the relationship. Identifying this move requires a calm mind and a clear record of reality. When accusations arise, pause before you react. Ask yourself, is this truly my pattern, or is it a mirror of something they've been doing? Often, you'll notice the behaviors they accuse you of are the exact ones they've shown before. This awareness is your anchor. The solution isn't to out-argue them. That only fuels the cycle. Instead, quietly withdraw from the blame game. Keep your boundaries firm and your self-perception intact. Remember, their accusations are less about who you are and more about what they can't face in themselves. Philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." The avoidant cannot follow this because truth would require them to stand in the discomfort of their own flaws. But you can follow it by refusing to accept ownership of what was never yours. In doing so, you stop being the shield for their self-deception and start becoming the mirror they cannot avoid. And that's when projection loses its power, not when they admit the truth, but when you no longer let their false story define you. The moral high ground illusion when they claim you crossed the line. The moral high ground illusion is a psychological tactic an avoidant person uses, wrapped in the language of principles and justice, but designed to make you look wrong and themselves right. When an avoidant senses that their weaknesses or mistakes might be exposed in a relationship, they shift to a narrative that places them on a pedestal of moral superiority while pushing you down. In this moment, the core of the disagreement stops being about the real issue and becomes about your tone, your approach, or a small action you took, which they frame as crossing the line to strengthen their position. For example, if you confront them about irresponsible behavior, they may sidestep the main point and say, "Why did you speak to me in that tone?" or by saying that you disrespected me. On the surface, these statements sound like they're about preserving dignity and respect, but in reality, they're meant to divert the focus so you abandon your original point and go into defense mode. Philosopher George Berkeley once said, "When the argument is weak, a man often raises his voice." Avoidants do something similar, but instead of raising their voice, they raise the moral bar. It becomes a standard where every flaw of yours is magnified while their own mistakes disappear. To spot this illusion, ask yourself in every conflict, does the focus shift away from the actual issue to your delivery, words, or some minor action? Do you find yourself apologizing repeatedly even when you're not at fault? If so, you're likely caught in the trap of moral high ground. The first step to breaking free is to distinguish between someone pointing out a genuine boundary you crossed and someone using the "you crossed the line" claim to dodge accountability. Before reacting emotionally, pause and revisit what the original disagreement was about. Is this accusation connected to that, or is it a new distraction? Psychologist Deborah Serrani once wrote, "Some people use principles not to find the truth, but to bury it." Keep that in mind because it will protect you from falling for this illusion. When you learn to identify this tactic and keep your focus on the real issue, you strip the avoidant person of the power that comes from their moral high ground facade. At that moment, they're left with two choices: confront the truth or fall silent. And more often than not, silence is what they choose because their strongest weapon, the illusion of moral superiority, no longer works on you. The victim costume. The victim costume is one of the most subtle yet manipulative psychological tactics an avoidant person can use when they cannot face their own mistakes or shortcomings. They adopt a role that shields them from criticism and pulls others' emotions to their side. This role is the victim. The purpose of this strategy is to shift the focus away from the actual issue and onto their pain, misfortune, or perceived suffering. In doing so, the original fault becomes blurred, and you often unknowingly step into the role of their protector. Philosopher Albert Camus once said, "People often turn their wounds into shields so no one can see the weapon in their hand." That principle is exactly what's at play here. An avoidant person will share details of their hardships, past traumas, or current pressures in a way that makes it difficult for you to hold them accountable. For example, if they have been neglectful in the relationship, they might say, "You don't understand how much pressure I'm under right now," or "My childhood was like this. I can't handle these situations." While these statements may sound harmless or even vulnerable, their real effect is to steer attention away from their actions and toward their emotional protection. The way to recognize this tactic is to notice whether every problem somehow ends with the responsibility being shifted away from them towards circumstances, the past, or even you. Do you find yourself constantly setting aside your own feelings to prioritize their story? If so, you are witnessing the victim costume in action. The first step in protecting yourself from this is to learn the difference between empathy and accountability. Empathy is necessary, but it does not mean ignoring the truth. When they share their story, listen with compassion, but also keep focus on the core issue. Remember key facts and make it clear that sympathy is not the same as excusing responsibility. Psychologist Harriet Breaker once wrote, "You cannot sacrifice your truth in order to ease someone else's pain." Keep this in mind because it is exactly what protects you from being pulled into this trap. Ultimately, once you recognize this tactic and hold your boundaries, you not only protect the truth, but you also break the cycle where your emotions are always placed second. For the avoidant, this moment is the most uncomfortable because when the victim costume comes off, their true responsibility stands exposed, and that is the very truth they have been avoiding all along. In the end, these tactics, the history rewrite, the projection reflex, the victim costume, the moral high ground illusion, the guilt reversal trap, and the silence weapon are all designed for one purpose: to protect the avoidant from the discomfort of facing themselves. Each one is a shield crafted not to preserve truth, but to preserve the image they hold of themselves, untouchable, blameless, and in control. When you understand these patterns, the power begins to shift. You stop chasing explanations they will never give. You stop apologizing for boundaries that were necessary. You stop letting their silence speak louder than your truth. It's not your role to dismantle their illusions or rewrite the story in their mind. Your role is to protect your own reality, the one you lived, felt, and endured. Keep your memories intact, your self-respect guarded, and your boundaries firm. Because the truth is, the avoidant's greatest fear isn't losing you. It's losing the version of themselves they've fought so hard to believe in. And when you step out of their narrative, refuse to play the role they've assigned you, and hold on to your truth without trying to convince them, you take away the only power their tactics ever had. They may never admit the truth. They may never change the story. But they will know somewhere deep down that you saw through it. And that knowledge will outlast even their silence.